I'm Margo Schlanger. I teach civil rights at the University of Michigan Law School, and I'm here to talk to you today about civil rights and about teaching about civil rights to high school students, to college students, and how to make that as effective and relevant a topic as possible. About 10 years ago, I founded a website, the Civil Rights Litigation Clearinghouse, and in doing that, what I was trying to accomplish was to make materials about civil rights litigation widely available on the web so that people could see how civil rights cases are current and how they matter in their communities and their lives. And so that's the way that I want to propose to you that you might teach about civil rights. So I have a few guiding principles that I like to use in talking about civil rights teaching. One is that civil rights is something current, not something historical. So not merely something historical. Now, we all know that the civil rights era in the 60s had a lot of really important things that happened in it, and that is something that students should learn about. They should learn about the marches and the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act and all of those things. But civil rights is also something that happens right now in our communities. It's what happens when prisoners sue their prisons, what happens when immigrants sue the government and ask for fairer process or more equitable procedures. It's what happens when women sue their companies for discrimination. All of that is right now. It's really current. And so that's the first principle. The second principle is that what goes on in civil rights litigation when people argue about civil rights, when they make lawsuits about civil rights, is that these are contests about what justice requires. This is not simply enforcing something that everybody agrees is right and fair. This is the way that our polity has chosen to together decide what is fair and what the law requires. And where that takes place, in part, is in civil rights protests and civil rights litigation. The third principle is that civil rights struggles are local as well as national, that there are civil rights contests happening right now in your neighborhood, in your schools, in your workplaces, and that if people think that this is only something that happens, and this is the fourth principle, only something that happens in the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, they make a mistake. In fact, there are civil rights struggles that are local, and there are civil rights lawsuits that are in all of the many courthouses closer to home. And the fifth principle, that the landmark cases that everybody knows about, Brown versus Board of Ed, Obergefell about same-sex marriage, these huge cases are joined by smaller scale contests that involve people just like you, just like your students. So these are the principles under which seem to me to be super important when you're teaching about civil rights. And what I have done is put together materials that bring real-life civil rights cases alive and make them available. So there's real-life pleadings and outcomes of the cases in a way that's very useful for teachers and for students. And those are available at clearinghouse.net. And then I've put together weeks worth, about 6 weeks worth of curricular materials at clearinghouse.net/schoolhouse. So those materials allow people to teach by way of role plays, mock trials, mock arguments. They open up the available nonfiction text so people can learn about them and read them. They are materials that implement the principles that I just talked about. And all of it is user-friendly and available for you to use. So I think that if you want to teach about civil rights, I urge you to use those materials. But even apart from that, I urge you to keep in mind those 5 principles that I talked about. Now, I want to pause for 1 second and just do one other thing that a lot of teachers have told me is very useful. And that is, I want to talk about the distinction between civil rights and civil liberties, because this is something that gets talked about and tested, and I don't think that people really understand it. So it doesn't make a lot of difference whether a particular claim injustice is a civil rights claim or a civil liberties claim. When you file a lawsuit, nobody says to you, is it a civil rights case or is it a civil liberties case? But there are people who want to know, well, what's the difference between civil rights and civil liberties? And so I thought I would spell that out for you in a way that I hope is useful. So civil rights in the modern era are claims involving equality. Now, that's not always been what civil rights has been called. In the 19th century, civil rights meant something quite different. It meant rights for participation in the civil state, the right to own property, the right to make contracts, those kinds of things. But civil rights now means claims involving equality. And civil liberties means claims against the government for basic rights. And of course, that means that some things are both, because you can have claims involving equality that are against the government for basic rights. But generally speaking, that's the divide. And so just to make a useful schematic for teachers, because a lot of teachers have asked me this question, this slide that I'm putting up right now shows you the difference between civil liberties and civil rights and the overlap between them. And so I hope that it is very useful to you. What it shows you is that civil rights includes things like no discrimination in employment, no discrimination in housing and education, etc., right? It's quintessentially anti-discrimination law. Civil liberties is quintessentially about the Bill of Rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and so on. But civil rights against the government, the equal protection of the laws, really lies at the overlap between them. But in general, we have learned and grown to call those civil rights rather than civil liberties. So that's all. The basic message that I want to give is not this very particular message about civil rights and civil liberties, though I hope that's useful to you. It's that I want to urge you to think about, when you teach civil rights, bringing it into the present and making it really a bottoms-up, close to home topic for your students. And if you want materials that can help you do that, to send you to theclearinghouse.net/schoolhouse.